did the T-Rex have feathers?
So we don't have any definite T-Rex skin impressions. So finding stuff like feathers and fossilized skin is very difficult. You have to have exactly the right conditions to get it preserved. We have animals that are probably in the same created kind as T-Rex that do show lots of scales in their body, but we have lots of fossils of animals that have both feathers and scales. So I would say when you're an animal that's like 5 to 7 tons, you don't need to have some kind of furry or fuzzy covering. When you look at elephants and hippos and rhinos, right, like what do? They all have very little fur, except when they live in really cold climates, like a mammoth, where you would have lots of fur. So my guess would be if they did have some kind of feathery thing, it would probably only be as like a little baby, and maybe you'd lose that and just have scales. But we don't know for sure. We don't have the fossil evidence. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I meant to say this in the talk, but I don't even know what time it is anymore because I'm so confused. But I think it's really important. This is why I want to take the time to say it now. As someone who's involved in creation science, you can get really excited about the science side of things, and you can sometimes forget that it's not on the same level of authority as Scripture, right? And so we can have scientific ideas, and those could turn out to be wrong. Like I have a very clear idea in my head of what layers I think were made by the flood and which ones weren't, but I could be wrong, right? I have a very clear idea of how to think through this whole feathered dinosaur issue, but I could be wrong about aspects of it. And so it's always important that we make sure we put our firm stance on what we know is true, right? What's revealed by God, and then we're more open-handed with the other stuff. And so I always make my policy, if I don't know for sure, I just tell you, I don't know. Maybe. Good question. I'm just going to take whoever the mic goes to. So you bring the mic to somebody and I'll answer that question.
I was just wondering if you think that these extinct creatures might be resurrected someday so we could enjoy them in the new heavens and the new earth.
Oh, I was going to ask, is this a Jurassic Park thing or is this a God thing? Okay, so I like that question because I always get the other one, and this one's much more interesting to me. I think so. But I think that's my wishful thinking more than anything else. Like, there's nothing in Scripture that tells us that. He's going to make a new earth. It talks about there being plants. If plants work the way they do now, they need pollinators. So there's things to think about, right? It seems like there would be animals. It seems weird to me that God would make an entire earth and not fill it with creatures. That seems to be kind of his deal, right? That's what he does. And so I think there will be animals. I really like what C.S. Lewis says about this, that he says, along the lines of basically every good expression we see of God's glory here below, there will be even greater magnification in heaven. So he talks about like, will lions be in heaven? And he's like, well, yeah, but they won't be like lions here. And so he's got his whole idea. Obviously this is just C.S. Lewis talking. But I think that the general principle is God desires to show us how glorious and wonderful he is. And one of the ways he does this is by showing us wonders. And so if he could make something as cool as these things down here, then I am confident whatever he makes in the future will be that much better. That's the best thing I can say. And that gets me excited to think about that. But yes, I'm crossing my fingers hoping for some dinosaurs for sure as part of that. Yeah. We got a question. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Mine is there are a couple of parts. So with the flood and the tectonic plate shift, if there ever was one, how does that now relate with the pre-flood world? Is it an assumption that the tectonic shift was so great now that you have a separation of the environment, which was initially closer together? And how now would we explain the habitat before pre-flood and the habitat after pre-flood? And is there evidence in the current fossils that show that, okay, the animals are distributed, they are distinct according to the regions? And can there be evidence to show also the pre-flood inhabitants, or rather how the tectonic plates were before?
Yeah, that's a great multi-part question, and so I will try my best to answer that. There's a lot going on there. So first thing is about tectonic plates, right? So we know the continents are moving. You can measure this today. So I always tell my students in California, we get farther away from Europe and Africa every year. Now it's tiny amounts. I mean, it's like the speed at which your fingernails grow, right? And so it's very, very slow, but it is measurable. And so you can just reverse the tape on that, right, and slam the continents back together. But the problem is you end up with hundreds of millions of years of time. And so creationists have thought a lot about this, and they said, well, we know the continents are moving. We've got good fossil evidence and rock evidence for how they used to be arranged. Is there anything that could allow the continents to move faster, right? And so there was a really cool model developed in the 90s and then in the 2000s. It's called catastrophic plate tectonics. And the main guy who's associated with this, his name is John Baumgartner. You can look him up. And basically his idea is that the flood is driven by catastrophic plate tectonics. And so you have all the continents together originally before the flood. God kickstarts the flood. We don't know exactly what he does. Some people like to say he just shut the door so loud that, it started everything. I don't know. God started the flood. What we do know in the text of Scripture is it says the flood began by the fountains of the great deep bursting forth and the floodgates of heaven opening up. And that's Genesis 7:11. So when you think about that, okay, it talks about rain, but what is the water coming from underneath? And so the thinking is when he did this computer modeling with a supercomputer to do catastrophic plate tectonics, that as you start having, and I'm going to get all technical here, okay, I'm trying my best, okay? Basically, you have ocean crust that goes underneath other ocean crust or underneath continental crust. And so it starts sinking into the Earth's mantle. And when this happens, it creates some friction and there's some melting there. And the melting allows it to actually speed up because it's providing for there to kind of counteract the friction. And so the idea is as it starts slipping, it slips faster and you get a runaway effect. And that allows the continents to move much, much faster, potentially on the order of meters per second, like 2 meters or 6 meters or something. They go pretty fast. And this is what the computer model suggests. And so when that happens, you have other parts in the world where new ocean crust is being made, right? Because you have to create and destroy at the same time. And those are places we call mid-ocean ridges today. So when we were flying over from California to here, and we were looking at the map on the screen, and we kept trying to look out the window, and it was just ocean, right? But we flew over the mid-ocean ridge, which is the biggest mountain chain on the earth, and it's deep in the Atlantic. And I was telling Michael, I was like, there it is. It's the mid-ocean. Well, you can't see it. This is water, when you look out there. But we knew it was there because of Google Earth. We could see it. And it goes all the way around the world. It goes through all the Earth's oceans. That is where new ocean crust is made. And so if the crust is being destroyed fast in some places and being made fast in other places, that is really hot material coming up, lava that's coming up from underground, and it's going to heat up the oceans. And the model predicts that it makes the oceans so hot in those spots that it actually shoots them as steam jets. And so those steam jets shoot up into the sky, and then of course, as you know, what comes up must come back down, right? And so all of a sudden, just from this scientific model, you have a way to have fountains from the great deep burst forth and floodgates of heaven open up, right? Which is cool. Now, like I said, every scientific model is subject to change, right? It's not like Scripture, which is certain, but we do think that plate tectonics is happening during the flood. And so if you have the continents separating, combining, and separating again during the flood, you're going to destroy ecosystems, which is getting to the second part of your question, and habitats. So when we look at the fossil record, we find animals buried for the most part in what looks like their ecosystems. The animals that they lived with, they died with. The plants that they ate, in general, they died with. And you can sometimes even find their fossil poop there. You can find all kinds of things that tell you, like footprints, okay, they were kind of living here. And so what it looks like is that the world, I think, was much more zoned off in the pre-flood world. Like you had very clear ecological places that animals lived, almost kind of, you could think of it kind of like a zoo or like a cultivated garden. And then when the flood came and destroyed all that, like I said, we have a post-apocalyptic world afterward, everything kind of just gets more random where it settles. There's not as much intentional design potentially. Obviously, God's sovereign. I'm not saying he's not. But I'm saying he's letting the animals, okay, go do that, as opposed to the original creation where it might have been much more sectioned off. And we do see evidence for that in the fossil record. This is a long answer. But it was a long question in my defense. So the seafloor, right, and the Cambrian, these are some of our lowest fossil layers. There's 2 spots in China, exact same age. They're both marine. They're not that far away from each other, even we think in the past. And yet they're almost completely different in the types of animals they have. And so you're like, how does this happen? That doesn't happen in our oceans today. Yeah, I think the world was much more kind of intentionally designed in the way it looked in the pre-flood world, and then our after the flood world. It's still beautiful, but it's got scars and, it's a little bit different. It's been through some stuff, right? And that's good. That's how God intended to design it. So that was my best attempt to answer all that. If you have more thoughts, we can talk afterwards. But it was a good question. Yeah. He's really wanting to ask a question. He's excited about it, so.
I'd just like to know your stance on carbon dating, because this is a big thing used in the billions of years theory.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot that probably disproves it in the creation theory.
Okay. How long do you guys want to stay here? So I always get this question when I speak at churches. It's a great question, but it's one of those things where like there's so much background information to get us to that point that it's difficult to answer. So I'll try my best to kind of keep it succinct, but essentially carbon dating is one form of a bunch of types of things we call radiometric dating. And carbon dating, it works with carbon. That's the name, right? And carbon is in living things. And you can date it because of the decay that there's certain types of carbon that will decay into nitrogen inside of you after you die. The problem with carbon dating is that the carbon decays very fast. And so you can only use carbon dating for things that are less than like 40,000, maybe 30,000 years old. You say 50. They're saying even 50 is sketchy now. I don't want to argue with you. We can talk later. So the reason is because the carbon gets so small, you can't detect it reliably anymore. And so people don't actually try to carbon date dinosaurs or coal or anything like that because they think it's too old. And so some creationists were like, what if we did carbon date those things? Like, what would happen, right? And it turns out you can actually find carbon signatures, but it's one of those problems where you're getting close to that 30 to 40,000 year mark, and it's like it could be contamination, and it's really easy for an evolutionist to just be like, contamination, and you just move on, right? And so as a creationist, you're like, okay, well, we could send it off to another lab and get it tested, do repeated trials. Problem is, once labs figure out that creationists are using their lab, they're not really super happy about that typically, right? Because they can get a bad name for that. And you say, oh, well, creationists start their own lab. You can see the problem there, right? Hey, we got the results we wanted again. It looks bad, right? And so you're kind of in a little bit of a rock and a hard place, but there are people working through that. What I would say is that with carbon dating, it's very reliable for relatively recent stuff. So when you look at like the Middle Ages or things at like the time of Christ, carbon dating is pretty accurate. And we've got lots of ways to confirm that it works. What's interesting is even in the secular community, there's a recognized point about the time of Joshua where the carbon dates start diverging pretty drastically from other dating schemes. And they've got a name for it, I can't think of it right now. And so that's telling them, okay, something funky is happening. And we're like, yes, something funky is happening because we think the flood messed with it. Because carbon-14 depends on the atmospheric carbon. And so if your atmosphere has a drastic change at some point in history, that's going to mess up all your carbon dates. And I would guess that the flood involved a drastic atmospheric change. And so that's where there may be something interesting going on there, that the closer you get to the flood, the more the carbon dates go to infinity. And so, like, I think there's some reliable stuff there. When it comes to the other dating methods people use, the uranium lead and samarium neodymium and potassium argon, all these other types, creationists, the dominant model right now is the idea that we think those things were accelerated during the flood. And so something was going on during the flood that made these isotopes decay faster than they normally do. And so there's people still actively working on that. There's some cool research that I think shows that they did speed up in the past, but that would take me an hour to explain all that. And none of you want to sit through that. Some of you want to sit through that. I don't know if I want to sit through that. But if you want to talk more about that afterwards, I'd love to talk to you about it, but I don't want to like hold everybody hostage as I explain isotopes. That was my best attempt at a short answer. Okay, good. I don't know who's got the microphone. There it is.
I just want to know, with regards to the atmospheric change, does that mean that the oxygen levels would have dropped after the flood? Because I've heard that could be why dinosaurs don't exist now.
Why diamonds? Dinosaurs. Oh, I was really confused. I was like, I don't think that has anything to do with diamonds. Okay. It's a good question. I mean, I don't know how much changing carbon isotope ratios would affect like your oxygen isotope ratios and oxygen, like content of oxygen in the atmosphere. I'm not a climatologist or meteorologist, so I'm gonna like start with that disclaimer. I do think dinosaurs, my suspicion is it has more to do with ecosystems than it does like atmospheric conditions. That just the plants that the herbivores needed had died out for the most part. If you look at like the plants we have today, it's dominated by our flowering plants. A lot of our dinosaurs depended on gymnosperms, so like cycads and ginkgos and stuff that are much rarer today. And so that may be more a factor. And then the meat eaters that ate the plant eaters, that kind of cascade effect. But yeah, I mean, you can definitely look into it. It's a possibility. It's just my personal guess is that I don't think it's as relevant. You do have tons of volcanic activity that's putting ash in the atmosphere during and after the flood. And so that also, and other chemicals, that could also mess with some stuff too. And so that might make it difficult if you're a really big animal for breathing. I don't know. Thoughts there? What do you think, Michael? Yeah, you can think about it. We can talk later about it. I'll send her to you, and you can answer that. Yeah. There you go. He has some thoughts. There's a lot of hands, so you just chuck the microphone, they'll grab it. It's like a bouquet, like at a wedding. Yeah.
What is the largest excavation that you've done?
Like largest in terms of area or the amount of fossils or?
I would say in like terms of like biggest dinosaur.
So most of the work I've done is digging in Wyoming. And so the main dinosaurs they find there are TRex and Triceratops. And the really common one is a big duck-billed dinosaur called Edmontosaurus. Edmontosaurus could get I'm using feet. Darn it. I got to make conversions. It gets big, okay? So, we would say like if you think about like 10 to 12, 13 meters, some of these dinosaurs are getting in length, and some of them are weighing multiple tons. We typically find their isolated bones. They're all jumbled up, and you kind of have to sift through it. But there are a few sites on the ranch where we dig where they've found like most of the animal together. So they've got one really big Triceratops skull. It's really cool. It's like this long, and then like there was like the leg of the Triceratops there, and then the rest of him was gone. I don't know what happened to him. And then they found one where it was the Edmontosaurus tail, and I mean it's like just going, all the bones in place and everything. So there's been some really cool stuff, but I haven't been involved with any sauropods, for which I'm very thankful because those are the ones that are like, 30, 35 meters long, and I don't want to be digging up something like that. That would take you years to get one bone out. I mean, it's crazy. They're really big. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. I've got a somewhat cheeky question for you. You said that you think the dinosaurs went extinct after the flood. Okay, so if I remember correctly, the story of Noah gives the dimensions of the ark. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of scholarship trying to figure out how big 40 cubits actually is in today's standards. How did these dinosaurs that were the size of buildings fit on the ark?
Yeah, great question. That's been an old question. So even before they found dinosaurs in the 1600s, they were arguing about could you fit everything in the ark, right? So there's a few things going on there. Number one, we got to remember he's bringing air-breathing land animals. He doesn't need a fish tank, okay? Get that out of your head. Number two, you only have to bring 2 of each kind, except for clean animals. So if we're talking about these building-sized dinosaurs, yes, there's 200-300 species of these we've recognized, but it may be only like 5 to 15 kinds of them. And so that really limits the number of them you need to bring on. And then there's no rule that says you have to bring the absolute biggest individual you find, right? So when you think about like some of our titanosaurs, when they've cut open the bones and figure out how old they are, the really big individuals might be in their 40s or 30s. And so they're sexually mature at like their teens. And so you could bring a much smaller individual on the boat and not have a problem. Thing is, even if you bring the biggest ones, they will actually fit. Doesn't really matter what cubit you use. They'll be okay. And so if you guys get a chance to go to Kentucky and see the Ark Encounter, you'll see like a life-size model. I mean, this is cool, but you actually get to see a life-size one. And they do have some dinosaurs models that they put on there. They actually look really cool. The sauropod they picked was like a really tiny one. I was really disappointed. I was like, come on, like make a big one. But I really think you could do subadults and you'd be fine. They're going to be reproductively viable afterwards, and you're not going to sink the boat that way. So that'd be my guess. Plus, God brought the animals to him. That's the other thing to remember. So God picked them. So he knows what he's doing. That's what I would go with. But it's a great question.
Your definition of dinosaur, I love that. I never knew that, never thought of that. In the book of Job, then, the Leviathan, would that not be classified as a dinosaur? And then Behemoth, are we able to classify those two in more or less into what groups they fit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Job, you read about the behemoth and Leviathan. They're words in Hebrew that are left untranslated on purpose because we don't know what they are, right? And so that's smart for the translators. So behemoth is only mentioned in Job 40. Leviathan gets mentioned also in Isaiah and in Psalms and in another time in Job. And so there's different schools of thought on what these things are, right? So your first, if we make a little chart for ourselves, a little flow chart, okay? Are they real animals or not real animals, okay? And you're like, not real animals, that's ridiculous. There are some conservative scholars, biblical scholars, who would say these are symbolic creatures, that God just is telling a story to teach Job about Satan or to teach Job about justice or something. So I'm not in that camp. Number one, because the descriptions seem very animalish, right? Like, it eats grass like an ox. Justice doesn't eat grass. Like, I don't even know what that means, like symbolically. Like, that's a really weird metaphor, okay? So it sounds like a real animal. Additionally, Leviathan is mentioned in other passages. Sometimes it is symbolic. So in Isaiah, I can't remember the chapter, 27, something like that. Isaiah talks about Leviathan as this serpent that God kills with the sword, and it's very clearly a reference to Satan. But Psalm 104, in the psalmist's description of creation and how God maintains creation, he says that the Leviathan frolics in the sea with the ships. It's like, well, that doesn't sound like Satan. He doesn't seem like a frolicking kind of guy, you know? And so that sounds like a real animal again, right? So I think that they are real animals. I think God is describing to Job real animals that he made. Then you got the question, okay, what is the animal, right? So conventional interpretations on this, you'll hear, and your Bible probably has a footnote on this. Behemoth, it'll say maybe elephant or hippopotamus. For Leviathan, it says might be a crocodile. So for behemoth, I'm not a big fan of the hippo or elephant explanation because one of the descriptions of behemoth is that his tail is like a cedar tree. And you guys know what hippo and elephant tails are like, better than I do, okay? They're not like cedar trees, okay? So I don't think that really makes sense. I think it's something else. Leviathan being a crocodile, it does describe it breathing fire. Is that a actual physical description of fire coming out, or is it he's so angry that his anger sets coals ablaze, which is actually a description God uses of himself in one of the Psalms? I don't know. I'd like to talk to a Hebrew scholar about that. But it does talk about Leviathan going on the ocean. It says, one of the first things it says about him is, can you draw him out with a fish hook? And it's a rhetorical question. You cannot. But if you read Herodotus, he talks about how to catch crocodiles with fish hooks. So it doesn't seem like it's a normal crocodile to me. Could it be one of our extinct giant crocodile relatives? Could it be some kind of marine reptile? Those are within the realms of possibility. Could behemoth be a dinosaur? Yeah, it's possible. Am I going to plant my flag there? Definitely not. Because I don't know for sure, right? I want to be open-handed with that. The Bible doesn't say it's a dinosaur. There could be other animals that we haven't discovered that fit that description even better. And so I think it's one of those things, you know, when you're thinking about, you know, talking about your faith with somebody, it's like, okay, what do I know for sure? What are the certain things? What are the things I think I know? And what are the things that I have no clue on, right? And it's always best to be honest. People are going to appreciate that. They might be upset with you because you're honest, but at the end of the day, they're gonna be like, but he didn't lie to me. And that was nice, you know? So that's why I'm not lying to you right now. I don't know for sure. I think it could be, but like I said, I'm not going to stake my reputation on it. I will stake my reputation on Jesus rising from the dead, because that's very clear in text, right? I will stake my reputation on, you know, that the words of Job are the words that God wanted to be recorded and that they're truth. But I don't think there's enough description there to be 100% certain about what the animal is.
So you won't start the Behemoth Baptist Church?
There you go. We could do that. BBC. Any takers? Yeah. I don't know if we have other questions or time for questions. Oh, yeah.
What is your favorite dinosaur and why?
Yeah. My favorite dinosaur is the Pachycephalosaurus. That's the one that has the dome on the head. I've liked that ever since I was 4 years old. That was my favorite. And I just think it's great that it just has a giant dome on its head. Not that I want a giant dome on my head, but that dome is solid bone. So in a big Pachycephalosaurus, that can be like 9 to 10 inches thick of bone. What is that in centimeters? Multiplied by 2.54. Yeah, you got the idea. Okay, it's thick. It's like this, okay, of bone. Not much room for a brain in there, but enough. It was alive. It lived. It did its things. The fun thing about them is that we actually know very little about them because they're pretty rare dinosaurs, their whole family. And usually the only part that gets preserved is the head. And not only is it the head, it's the dome. Like, everything else will be gone, and you just have this thing that looks like a deformed soccer ball or something. And you're like, well, there it is. That's the dome. And so that's a lot of that game is figuring it out. And so there's a lot of cool mysteries there, and I think that's fun. But yeah, they're cool dinosaurs. Way in the back, there's a question. Oh, there's a question here, too.
Hi. Quick question. This sounds so weird. Are there any continents or regions that you haven't found dinosaurs or that there's no evidence of dinosaurs being there?
Yeah, so there are regions of continents where there's just no fossils of any kind. So like the center of Canada, the center of Australia, what are the other cratons? I'm trying to think of some other ones. But there are places where basically there probably were layers with fossils there and they got just completely scraped clean. And so it's just the core rock that like is the rock God would have made, I think, during the creation week. That's what's there. So that's cool that you can like walk up and touch a rock and be like, hey, I think God actually miraculously made this. Like, that's really cool. But you're not going to find fossils there. So like, if you go to Minnesota, it's funny, the Society for Vertebrate Paleontology meeting this year is in Minnesota. And I was like, why? There's no fossils there. I mean, it's just pre-Cambrian rock. I mean, there are some Ice Age things, I guess. But yeah, so there's just certain areas where they're just removed or there maybe weren't ever laid down there because maybe it was a high place before the flood or something like that. You know.
Brother, you have been traveling to different parts of the world and doing excavation for dinosaurs, and I suppose you've been to China as well.
I have not been to China.
Oh, you haven't been to China?
I have not been. I'd like to, but I have not
been. Well,
been.
because I wanted to ask the question, how were you received there by the communists?
I wasn't. So, yeah. We'll have to try it out. We'll find out. We'll do an experiment. I don't know.
The last two questions.
How long does it take to study paleontology?
So, good question. Most people who do research in paleontology typically need a master's or a PhD. So, you're going to be finishing high school, do an undergraduate program in university, so that's typically 3 to 4 years. And then on top of that will be another anywhere between 2 to 8 years of study. So usually people who go into paleontology, they start with either a biology or a geology degree, and then they go into it from there. But other people have other paths. There are people who are amateur paleontologists and get to be involved in research because they just become very knowledgeable about their area. But yeah, most people go on to get graduate degrees.
The stones referred to in Revelation and also diamonds, were they formed or do you think they were always here?
Well, God made everything, right? So, like it talks about in Colossians 1:16, 17, that Christ made all things. Everything that came into being was made through him. Exodus 20:11 says that the heavens and the earth were made in 6 days. So diamonds would have been part of that. Diamonds form deep inside the earth, and so we've got like a good model, I think, for how they formed and how they came to the surface. They're made of carbon, so they formed somehow. Did they form supernaturally during the creation week? That's entirely possible. Did God, just supernaturally speak them into existence? Did he supernaturally speak the earth, and then the process in the earth made the diamonds? We don't know for sure. But there's definitely, you can see like you can connect the dots between how a diamond would form, whether or not it actually formed that way in history. So in the same way, like if you had been there when Jesus turned the water into wine, like you know how wine is made. You'd be like, okay, this wine came from grapes that, were grown and then were crushed and fermented and all that kind of stuff. And you'd be dead wrong because he made it in an instant, right? But that doesn't mean you don't know how wine works, right? You'd still do. And so regardless of whether it was supernaturally like ex nihilo made or it was something that God made during the processes of the creation week or pre-flood world, we don't know for sure. But certainly like we can postulate about it and think about it. It was a good question. Yeah.
If it's fairly quick, you've got a preacher's voice.
Just related to the Behemoth and Leviathan, what's your view on the mythical dragons in cultures around the world?
Yeah, so the question was about dragons in different cultures, myths about them. So kind of a similar thing with Behemoth and Leviathan. I think there's something there, like even more so the fact that all these different cultures have stories about giant reptilian creatures that are scary. And there were giant reptilians that are creatures that are scary, like that kind of fits together really well. And the same way that almost every culture, ancient culture around the world has a flood legend, right? And they're typically global. And they a lot of times have a lot of similarities. I think we're passing on stories of things we remember from way back in the day. That being said, I think we need to be careful saying like, oh, this person has a dragon legend, they actually met a dinosaur. I mean, we can make up stories, right? So I think it could be that people way back in the day remembered dinosaurs and they passed on those stories on generations and generations, just like they passed on the flood stories. So it could be the dinosaurs were, hundreds or thousands of years before them, hundreds or thousands of years, to be clear. And they're just passing on the stories and embellishing them and stuff. But I suspect there's some kernel of real dinosaurs that are behind that, if I had to guess. Yeah.
Top 2 or 3 books introducing biblical creationism.
That's
someone
a
who
great
says
question.
all I've ever heard is Darwinian, evolutionary, macroevolutionary.
Yep.
The usual dogma.
Okay, top 3 books. Number 1 is The New Creationism by Paul Garner. He's a British geologist. The book came out, I think, in 2010. So it's a little bit dated, but it's still very good. I reread it last year. It's really fantastic introduction to how we think as scientists about creation stuff. So helping you understand kind of the big picture things that I kind of touched on here and there. The second book I would say is actually a textbook, but it doesn't really read like a textbook, so it's acceptable. And it's called Faith, Reason, and Earth History by Leonard Brand and Art Chadwick. That one is, especially if you're interested in Earth history questions, it just helps you think through how someone could be a scientist and still believe that the Bible is true, and what that actually looks like. And so it's a good book for that. The last one is a little bit technical, but not what you're thinking, okay? It's technical theologically, okay? And so this book just came out this year. I'm not getting any money for promoting this, but I really enjoyed it. I read it this summer, and I was like, this is fantastic. It's called Defending Sin, which is a funny title. He's defending the doctrine of sin, not defending that you should sin, okay? So the author is Hans Madueme, and the book is him addressing essentially how theologically your belief in creation is essential for you to have a consistent Christology, hamartiology, soteriology. All your beliefs about salvation and Christ and sin are still tied in with creation. And so I'll give you one little teaser with this, okay? Something I really took away from this, I was like, this is cool. So one of the things we believe about Christ as Christians is that he was fully man, right? Hebrews talks about this. He was made just like us in every way, and that he was without sin. He did not sin, ever. Well, here's the thing. If you're a theistic evolutionist and we ask, where did sin come from? Most of them say that sin came from our animal tendencies back when we were animals. Okay, so animals are sometimes mean to each other and bite each other and stuff. And so when, in their model, we evolved into humans and God put his image on us, those nasty tendencies became sin. So they would say sin is part of being a human. You can't be a human without having sin. We have a Christological heresy going on, okay? Because either, if you're a theistic evolutionist, Christ was fully human, but wait a minute, you said to be fully human means you have to be a sinner. So that means that Christ actually had a sinful nature. That's not okay. Flip side, if you want to agree with, orthodoxy that Christ was sinless, well, then he can't be fully man. And so you've actually backed yourself into a Christological corner by accepting evolution. And the thing is, most people who embrace these things, they never stop to think about that. They don't think about how these doctrines are interconnected. And that's why I really got out of the book. And there's a lot there, but I just thought that tidbit in particular, I was like, yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to use that in class now. So those are the three I'd recommend. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I wish we had more time. This has been riveting and fascinating. A special treat to have you here. Actually, the final question, how we can pray for your trip here. What brings a creationist paleontologist to South Africa? What are your objectives? What are you going to do in the Northern Cape?
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question because I need a lot of prayer. So obviously there's safety, travel, and stuff like that, that we have wisdom. But even more than that, I don't want my trip here to be a waste. This was not a waste. I'm great with that. But research-wise, pray that God would help me understand what I'm looking at, that he would help me to find things that are useful for what we're trying to do. And so what we're trying to do is stuff that hasn't really been done in creationism before. We're trying to understand these creatures that evolutionists say this is the crown jewel of evolution. They say it is the single best example of one class of animals evolving into another one. And that's straight from the literature. That's what people say. It's the textbook example. And yet creationists haven't really ever tried to tackle it. And so I'm trying to do that, and that's a big thing. And I didn't maybe realize how big it was when I started it. And so you got those fears that come in your mind, like, oh, can I really do this? Like, you get those anxieties that build up. And so just pray that, God would give me the confidence and then the ability to actually go and discover what I need to discover, to make connections I need to in my brain, for Michael to be helpful and give me all the answers, things like that. But seriously, it can be scary when you're taking on a really big question and you don't want to get to the end of it and be like, I don't know. You want to actually understand things. And so that's really my big prayer, is just that God would give me wisdom and understanding as I look at that. Yeah.
Well, let's express our thanks to Dr. McLain.